welcome to another episode of the Daily Wisdom Words podcast. I'm your co-host, Neil Trivedi.
Hello, I'm Rini. I'm also your co-host, and we want to thank you for joining us today and give you a very warm welcome to our latest episode.
Join us every Saturday at 9 a.m. Pacific time as we talk to guests who have stories, advice, and life hacks, all of which take you one step closer to that feeling of hope.
And today we are so thrilled and honored to be joined by clinical psychologist and forensic training expert, Lina Haji. Hi, Lina.
Hi.
Do you mind if we can call you Dr. Haji, we can call you
whatever you
Lina,
guys want.
whatever.
I'm down with whatever you guys are comfortable with. You're more than welcome.
Okay, with me, you're late to lunch. So there's late to lunch. Okay.
Yeah.
Don't call me late for dinner.
Thank you guys for having me. I can talk about psychology all day, so I'm excited to
My
be
favorite subject.
Okay.
Favorite.
Yes, mine too. Yeah. So.
All day.
Yeah, so let's start with, we'll get a little bit into your background because we're so interested in hearing how you got started. But before we do that, why don't you explain what exactly is forensic psychology and, you know, how is it different from criminal psychology? And is it anything like we see on TV with those CSI Miami shows?
So yes, of course. So the word forensic is a little bit misleading because people hear forensic and they just think CSI and crime scene, and they think I'm looking at dead bodies all day and picking bullets and blood up. So it's not that. That would be forensic science. Forensic psychology is anything having to do with the legal system intersecting with psychology. So criminal psychology is pretty much the same thing. I think that's more used in England and Canada as the terminology. Although criminal psychology can also be a little more focused on the causes and behaviors behind criminals, whereas forensic is really clinical psychology applied to answering a legal question. There's also correctional psychology. A lot of forensic psychologists start out in correctional psychology, correctional being a clinical psychologist in any kind of correctional facility. So that's how I started. I worked in prisons on and off for 20 years. And then
we're going to get into that. We're going to get into that.
Yeah.
Because I do, if you don't mind, could you talk a little bit about your background? Because I heard when you were 9 years old, you were depressed. Hello, weren't we all? And that's when you told your mom you wanted to be a psychologist.
That is correct.
Yeah,
my parents had a pretty kind of difficult divorce, and I had stopped eating at the age of 9, and I was a gymnast, and they took me, to neurologists and cardiologists, and they even stuck a camera down my throat to see if something was stuck, and they accused me of being anorexic, and that wasn't it at all. It wasn't a weight issue. I just felt like I couldn't eat. And then finally, after all these medical doctors, they took me to a psychologist who asked all these questions, and they said to my mom, there's nothing physically wrong with her. This is stress and anxiety and depression. She feels like she can't swallow because all of her anxiety and depression is somaticizing in her throat. And I left that mental health clinic in New York City, and I asked my mother, what does that woman do? And I remember this clearly, even though I was 9. And she said, that's a psychologist. And I was like, that's it. I'm sold. That's what I'm doing. Because it was the first time it felt like someone understood me and heard what I was saying. Like, I'm not trying to be skinny, or this isn't about gymnastics, or, I feel like I can't eat. And so that's it. I was sold from that point forward.
That is fascinating. That is really amazing. Because, look, if we all did that, what an easier life we'd have.
Yes.
Right?
I really do. I believe. Because my daughter, she suffers severely from anxiety and depression. And when I started her in therapy in middle school, and she wants to be a therapist, and I'm like, well, sweetie, you're a little smarter than that. Could you go maybe like psychologist? Because she tests off the charts and stuff like that. And she goes, Mom, we'll just see how it plays out. I'm like, okay.
That's awesome.
I'm backing off. But anyway, okay, this is like going to be my favorite question. What were the circumstances that led you to start working in a prison at the age of 23? Okay, so I have to let you know something.
Okay.
My husband's an attorney.
Okay.
And he's gone to prisons. Okay. He doesn't do criminal law, but sometimes there's a criminal wanting to sue the state. But anyway, he had a law clerk working with him that was a female, and they gave her a list of things that she could not wear: makeup, perfume, lipstick, tie your hair back, wear a suit as close to a man's. So as gorgeous as you are, girl, how did they ever let you into prison, especially at 23?
You are too sweet, and I need to be on this podcast more often because you're absolutely amazing.
Every day.
I mean, so what happened was that I took a kind of a dumbed down forensic psychology course in my bachelor's program, which was at Lehman College in the Bronx, and it was called Psychology and the Law. And it's funny you say that because I remember this like gorgeous blonde Barbie looking woman walks in, and she's just beautiful and captivating and stunning, and she starts talking about working with serial killers and psychopaths and sex offenders, and I was sold. I was like, that's it. That's what I'm doing. I'm working with criminals. It was like Silence of the Lambs had just come out, or maybe it had been out a little while in the 80s, I guess. It had been out a while, yeah. And I just remember Clarice, another really attractive woman just talking to Hannibal Lecter. And it was, growing up in New York, I really didn't, there was fear all around us sometimes. And so at 23 with a bachelor's degree, I had no idea what I was doing. I saw there was this like halfway back, basically minimum security work release prison in New Jersey that was looking for bachelor's levels counselors. I applied, and they said to me when I got there, if you want to work with inmates, you're going to come back tomorrow at 10 a.m. and give a 45-minute lecture on emotions to 45 inmates.
Wow.
Oh my God.
I wish I could hear that lecture. I would love to.
But the next day I went in, knees buckling, sweating, shaking, to 100 grown men in orange uniforms. And somehow they listened to me. They respected me. There was no, you have your occasional cat caller and disrespectful guy, but they're humans just like the rest of us. And I felt like, they were listening. And also, my parents worked for the United Nations, and it was very drilled in my head. Yeah, I'm very lucky. I was very drilled in my head from an early age that my life needs to involve helping forgotten populations and underprivileged populations, and not to sound like a kumbaya poster child, but it was very drilled in my head that, you have to help people in your life. And so it was really a natural progression, because who really thinks or cares about inmates? Not a lot of people. So that's what happened.
Well, I think one of the worst things we ever did is make them privatized. Because
that's what I wrote my dissertation on.
Yeah, that's just, they just want money.
Oh, wow.
They just want money.
Yeah.
They don't want to help these guys.
Yeah.
But now I want to thank you, because I'm going to have kumbaya, my Lord, kumbaya in my head all day.
Yeah. So,
I wrote my dissertation on the horror of privatized prisons. Yeah.
Oh my God, I'd love to read that.
That's amazing.
I bet.
Yeah, that is amazing. Yeah. So as you started down that path and working in prisons and working with inmates and all that, what are some of the things that you started observing and learned along the way as far as psychology of criminals versus people like us? Like you said you've been to depression. I have clinical depression. Rainie's dealt with anxiety, but none of that ever made us go rob a bank or made us into criminals. So what are some of the different things that you observed as far as the psychology of criminals?
What I really noticed in a lot of the psychology of criminals is that they're just like us. They're all very, very different. They're all, some of them are just people who went down the wrong path and are just as normal as you or I. Some of them were born with very antisocial tendencies, lack of empathy, and maybe high on psychopathy, and criminality was just a way of them to express themselves. I also, mental illness doesn't cause criminal behavior, which is a large misconception. I think the biggest issue I have found in the criminal justice system that's correlated with criminality is substance abuse. I mean, people are in there because they've robbed people to feed their addictions. They've sold drugs to feed their addictions. And again, I'm not making excuses for that behavior, but I think it explains a lot. I think addiction, substance abuse is huge in the criminal population. But, criminals, some are, there's 19-year-olds who are doing time for selling weed because their mother was, strung out on drugs and their father was absent, and nobody cared if they showed up to school and they came from a low socioeconomic neighborhood and they had to feed their siblings, so they sold drugs. Right. And then you have, 45-year-old pedophiles who have raped tons of children, and those are two extremely different criminals. Those are two completely different beings, and yet we shove them in the same place. That's one of the biggest problems. So really, the problem is people say, well, what's the psychology of criminals? And that's a great question, but I think it's very individualized. And that's the problem with prisons. It's not individualized. It's just,
or we leave them,
go over there.
Or we leave them in the Catholic Church.
Or we leave them in the
Catholic Church.
Yeah.
I wrote my master's thesis on that.
Oh my God, girl, you are just amazing. Oh my God.
Like,
I would have loved to have gone into that. I know you don't. Yeah. I just, psychology is just what I read because I'm just fascinated by it, and we all grew up with trauma.
Yep.
So a lot of these guys, when you have to feed your siblings at 10 years old,
right,
because mama's strung out on drugs and daddy's gone, why can't we help these people, not put them away forever? We should have university of criminals, not criminals, prison, or, depending on the crime, of course. I don't think I want Jeffrey Dahmer hanging out in my university anytime soon, but
And that I think continuing on that thought, it's a good point that you were talking about how many of them are just normal people with abnormal circumstances that led them there. And I've heard you say in another interview that there's a misconception that people who are legally defined as crazy, whatever criteria there is, people tend to think, oh, that's who's probably most likely to become criminals. But you have said, like many times before, that that's definitely not true, and it's one of the biggest misconceptions. So can you touch on a little bit, and also what makes somebody legally crazy?
Yeah, so that's a really great question because, crazy is not a clinical term. Like you mentioned, Neil, it's a legal term, or insane. Insane is really the term, we go with. And how do we say somebody's insane clinically? Like, what does that mean, right? So it really has to apply to the legal question at hand. So for example, if I'm doing a not guilty by reason of insanity evaluation, I have to determine that that person's mental illness at the time of the offense caused them to have such a disconnect with reality that they were crazy, and that is why they committed the offense. So an example of that would be somebody who's severely schizophrenic and psychotic and who really believed, like, the government implanted chips in their brains, and they were, Andrea Yates is a great example of this. I mean,
oh my God,
was
I'm so glad you brought her up.
Yeah, because it was determined that she genuinely thought that her kids were going to be murdered unless she took them out first. So that would be an example of insanity. Well, but most people who are truly mentally ill are actually preyed upon and have to be segregated in prisons and psych units because they're the least likely to be violent. They're most likely to, to have their head down, and they're on heavy meds, and they hear voices, and they're very weak and fragile. They're not the ones, they're not the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world. Those are psychopaths, which is very different from mentally ill, if that makes sense.
Well, yes, definitely does. And you brought up Andrea Yates. She's fascinated me for years. And like, she said she heard the voices of, God or whomever she believed was telling her to kill her children. So was at the time she insane, or do you believe that she will and forever be without help?
That's a good question. And, assuming she's not a lifelong malingerer, which means a lifelong fake, assuming she's truly mentally ill, I believe that, you know, at the time of the offense, what I would say is she was, legally crazy. She was hearing voices or having delusions or visions or whatever it was, whatever her psychotic symptoms were that caused her to engage in this act that you and I cannot even imagine. Will she be like that for the rest of her life? No one knows. I mean, it depends on the treatment she gets. It depends on how effective the treatment is. Is it medication? Is it therapy? You know, there is treatment for psychosis. People who are very psychotic, typically they never return to normal, even with the best of medications and the best of treatments, but it can be managed. It can be definitely managed. So who knows? I mean, we would have to interview her in the psych hospital, which, Maureen, I would love to do that with you.
I would. Oh my God, you and I. Oh my God, I would love it. Yeah. I really would. I mean, you know, because I believe a lot of it is almost inherent in us, in our genes, in our DNA. And then when you don't get the love as a child and you're told you're nothing or you're garbage, you're not going to grow up being, you know, an outstanding citizen.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a lot of research on how there may be a predisposition. There are, you know, biological and neurological predispositions towards mental illness or substance abuse or even psychopathy. But those predispositions.
Could you explain psychopathy, sweetie?
Yeah, sure. So psychopathy is a construct of characterological behaviors, which so characterological behaviors, which include things like lack of remorse, lack of empathy, failure to take responsibility for actions, criminal versatility, narcissism and grandiosity. And it's really a 20 item, which I'm sure I could pull up if needed. It's a 20 item checklist based on the PCLR, which is the psychopathy checklist developed by Dr. Robert Hare, who is the, you know, guru on psychopathy. And it's basically 20 character traits that you score somebody on each of these traits. And if the score is from 0 to 40 on this particular instrument. Anybody above a 30 is considered a prototypical psychopath. Your normal human, your average human being is between a 5 and 7. And your average non-psychopathic inmate is usually around 24, 25. But psychopathy is really kind of, you know, Hollywood has it right sometimes. It really is, you know, your Jeffrey Dahmer, your Ted Bundy, somebody who just is incapable of having remorse or empathy. And so their acts are, you know, really self-driven. It's inability to feel any kind of, I don't feel sorry for what I've done, so I'm going to keep doing it no matter what it is, whether it's Bernie Madoff stealing millions of dollars from, you know, old people, or it's, you know, the Night Stalker stabbing random people in the middle of the night. It's just, it's very self-serving.
You talked about, you know, the determination as a little bit about the assessment and how some of that worked as far as psychopath. But I know another thing that you've talked about so much is the misdiagnosis for many criminals. In fact, I was just listening to an interview of yours of how I'm sure you take issue with that, and so many people take issue with that. So what are some of the more common reasons why that happens? Is it a lack of time, lack of resources, or just plain like not caring and just shoving these people by the numbers and saying, yeah, just diagnose them and get it over with? So
yeah, I think that's another great question, Neil. I think it's a combination of all of the above. You know, misdiagnosis is literally one of my biggest pet peeves because you know, it should be as horrible as physical diagnosis. You know, physical diagnosis, if you say it's a headache and it's not a headache, it's a brain tumor, that can have deathly effects. But in mental health, it's the same thing. I've seen people misdiagnosed as bipolar who are not bipolar, who actually have borderline personality disorder, and they'll be put on lithium and Depakote and given the wrong treatments. And it's like, you know, they go years and years wondering, why am I not getting better? Well, you're misdiagnosed and you're getting the wrong treatment. And I don't think we have enough passion around this issue because it's very prevalent, especially in the correctional system because of the things you brought up, Neil. So for example, you know, it's cheaper to get, and I'm not knocking any profession by any means, but it's cheaper to get an ARNP or a nurse practitioner with no kind of correctional or forensic training, no specialized training, than it is to get a forensic psychiatrist. Right? So let's just hire an ARNP who last year was working with kids and shove them in the prison. And then they don't know what they're doing. And it's not really their fault. They're not equipped to do this job.
Right.
And they just see somebody says, oh, you know, I wake up in the morning and I'm in a really good mood. But in the afternoon, if my girlfriend hasn't written me a letter, then I'm angry. And they're like, oh, you're bipolar. And it's like, that's not bipolar. That's called life. You know, that's called a normal life.
Stress.
Right.
Yeah.
It's called normal life. So they'll just rather bipolar, and they love over medicating inmates so that and it's understandable from the other, from a risk management perspective as well, because if you over medicate inmates, they're less likely to engage in violence and have fights. That being said, over medicating inmates, who a lot of them are substance abusers, you're only perpetuating the problem. So what we really need, and actually I saw a lot of this in the California prison system, which is to me by far the best. It has a long way to go, but it's by far the best because it's had so many lawsuits. They have, for example, in Florida, we have 1 psychiatric nurse practitioner, 2 psychologists, and maybe 5 social workers per prison. In California, you have 24 psychiatrists, 24 psychologists, 24 social workers, and 24 art and music therapists. So already with the amount of staffing and resources, the inmates are already getting more individualized care, specialized care. And you know, private prisons, which I worked at in Florida as a big hypocrite after I wrote my dissertation about it. You know, they don't want to pay for testing. They don't want to pay for actual treatment. They just want to make sure they don't commit a homicide and they don't suicide. We just don't want lawsuits. We really don't care what happens to them. Just no lawsuits. So there's no actual, you know, diagnostic process. There's no accurate treatment. There's none of that. And it's not the mental health professionals' fault. You know, these people who go in prison every day risking their lives, they're doing the best they can with what they have.
Law.
They're just given nothing.
Right.
And the law. Now, you just, oh my God, you're so amazing because it's like you're in my head.
I love
You, you just talked about the different people in prisons, psychiatrists, psychologists, clinical, you know, all that. Can you explain the difference of what the social worker, can you tell us the difference they play in all these prisons? And also, yeah, I'll get back to you on that.
Yes. So just like in the real world, in the non-prison world, psychiatrists, you know, they're medical doctors and they are more oriented towards prescribing medication, prescribing psychotropic medication, and we need them. We need them a lot. So they will do more brief assessments because it's more of a biological assessment. They will prescribe medication and then see the patient ongoing for, you know, prescription refills or prescription tweaking. Then you have psychologists, which ideally we would do full psychological batteries, psychological evaluations to get accurate diagnoses, IQ testing, behavior testing, personality testing to get an accurate diagnosis, and then formulate the treatment plan. However, in a lot of prison systems, they don't want to pay for testing. They don't want to pay for psychologists. They'd rather pay for master's level therapists, which I have nothing against master's level therapists.
Absolutely.
You know, I was a master's level therapist for 12 years. I'm also LMHC.
Let's pay master psychologists the money we pay basketball players and watch this world turn.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so
scientists.
They really have the master's level therapist. And again, I did this for 12 years. They're doing most of the grunt work. They're, you know, social workers, licensed mental health counselors, licensed marriage and family therapists. They kind of throw them all in one category as master's level clinicians. And they do a lot of the paperwork, the therapy, the group, the running of the groups. Psychologists are typically more clinical directors and we're overseeing, but the only reason they use us for that is because they need our license. I mean, it's not like they're using our specialties, you know, it's really sad. And again, this is not in all states and not in all prisons, but definitely Florida for sure.
Something about Florida. There's something about Florida. Well, I mean, did you guys watch the Michael Keaton movie about the drug addiction? He's a doctor and he gets addicted to OxyContin. And people just drove down to Florida, and the doctor would just say, you know, what's wrong with you? Oh, I hurt my back. Okay, here's 40 Oxycontin.
Don't even get me started.
That was Florida.
There are more drug rehabs in Florida than any other state because it's it's a $1 billion industry. They make tons of money. I mean, you can get Suboxone, and you know, I'm from New York, which is more progressive and treatment oriented. So people often ask me, like, what are you doing in Florida? I'm like, listen, if it wasn't for the cold, I would go right back.
You're right back.
But yeah, it's a mess down here, but there's no incentive to help drug addicts or, you know, there's no incentive because it's a huge money making machine. I mean, you guys know this. It's like, they can incarcerate them, then the private prisons can make money. They can write drugs, and then the pharmaceutical companies make money. I mean, everybody, the doctors make money who, like you said, my back hurts, so here's a prescription. I mean, everybody's making money off of people's misery. So why would we change it? I mean, that's how it goes.
The term you brought up earlier on, and something I really find fascinating, and hopefully you can fill us in on, is malingering, right? Which is like taking certain types of conditions, or at least trying to convince the system that they have one condition when they don't. So how, I'm sure this is very common, but how common is that? Like, how often do you see it? And what are the most common reasons for, I mean, the obvious being, obviously, they're trying to either get a reduced sentence or have some sort of alternative, but so fill us in on that whole thing about malingering.
Yeah, so malingering is another one of my specialties. I love it because it's kind of like, excuse my language, but it's like 99% of my job is weeding through the bullshit, which like makes me excited because it's like a chess game, you know, like because you know,
Mitch is good at chess.
The things with criminals is, you know, and again, I'm lumping them all together, but the things with criminals is that they're lying to you all the time. I mean, you're getting lied to all the time. I swear I took my meds. I swear I went to group. I swear I'll never do it again. And it's like, okay, so malingering in the correctional and forensic system is very, very common. And there's, you know, spectrum to malingering. Some people, you know, and malingering, again, faking a mental illness for a secondary gain. So why do people malinger? Well, as you mentioned, Neil, get a lighter prison sentence. They'd rather go to a psych hospital than a prison. But once they're in the correctional facilities, there's a multitude of reasons for malingering. A lot of them to hide out in mental health. So if you are mentally ill, you go to a mental health unit, which usually is a little bit cushier. You get to talk to female therapists. A lot of it is addiction driven, right? They'll say, I hear voices because they want psych meds, which they, you know, get high off, or they sell them, or they crush them and snort them. I mean, anything you can think of, it happens. Secondary gain, sex offenders are, you know, lowest on the totem pole in the prison system. So they will fake mental illness so they can, again, hide in mental health, avoid a gang hit, a drug debt. I mean, any criminal, insane behavior you can think of, they will pretend they have a mental illness to kind of, you know, get away from their problems, you know, and we're not doing them any favors by that's the other thing, you know, sometimes people think, well, it's harsh, you know, they're malingering, they're escaping something, or they're trying to escape something, or they want psych meds. Yes. I think it's important to understand, why are they malingering? You know, if it's because they're trying to get drugs, then we need to address the substance abuse behind the malingering behavior. If it's because they're scared because there's a gang hit on them, then we need to teach them coping skills on how to, you know, get out of the gang and how to stay not engaging in criminal activities. If it's because they're a sex offender, then they need sex offender treatment, you know, and it's obviously, I'm making it much more simpler than it is in real life, but we always, I think when it comes to treatment, we need to address, why do people malinger? Because that's the real underlying issue, you know?
Right.
So
right.
I think that
club them all together, like, and say, oh, all of these people are the dishonest, malingering people,
Correct.
And all these are not. And that's what you're saying is kind of basically happening, is they're all clubbed in one category.
So I think that we should have a new position in the United States called mental health whatever, and I nominate you. So Joe Biden, please get Dr. Haji in this position, because the world would change.
You're the best, Maureen. Thank you.
Oh, this is sincerity from my heart. I swear.
It is.
Like,
it
wow.
Is. And
wow.
you can see more importantly, more than anything else, is the passion that you're bringing to this topic and awareness. And I think that's really important for anybody working in that field.
Yeah.
Have that passion to want to make a change.
I bet you don't hate going to work.
I for sure. I mean, prison after a while was very stressful. In my 20s, it was super exciting, and it was crisis after crisis, and there's a stabbing, and there's a suicide, and there's a drug overdose, and it's like, yay. And then, you know, towards the end of my 30s, I was like, I don't have to live like this anymore. Like, I'm tired. I appreciate you talking about the passion, Neil, because that's the advice I give to all my students and all people who I train under me is, if you're not absolutely passionate about mental health, don't do it, because it's not for the money and it's not for the glory. You know, inmates are not going to say thank you, hardly ever. And so you really have to love it, and like, really it has to be at the core of your soul to go into mental health, because the rewards come in other ways, but when it is rewarding, it is so rewarding,
That's
like I heard,
really?
Speaking of that passion, and hopefully you can talk a little bit about this. I heard that you say that you love working with like psychopaths. Now, taken out of context, somebody might misunderstand that, right? Really? What's wrong with that? But it's obviously something that you actually thrive on in your profession. So can you talk about what is it about working with criminals that fascinated you so much earlier on?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's a couple of things. Number one, I'm one of those people that I've watched every forensic show on TV. I come home, I watch the first 48 and Lock Up and every forensic files. And my mother's like, don't you get enough of that at work? And 20 years in, I'm still like, no, I need to watch this all the time. So I think
the first 48?
It's a 48-hour, follows cops after the first 48 hours after a murder. Check it out.
No way.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah,
first 48.
It is.
It's good. You've seen it, Neil? It's amazing.
Love it.
Watch the first
I have. It's really interesting.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
It's very from a cop's perspective, but it's super interesting. Okay. So there was already that. And then, in my teenage years, I struggled a lot. I mean, I was a pretty rebellious kid. I got kicked out of school.
God.
Yeah.
I love you more and more.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was like, there was a time when my parents were just like, she's not going to make it, I was a bartender for many years in New York City at a young age. So you know what comes with bartending. I'll just leave that there. You guys, really intelligent people, and I had depression. I had anxiety. I had panic attacks. I was partying. I was rebelling. I was angry. I was fighting. I was not doing well at all. And for a long time, it was kind of like, am I going left or right? And so there was a part of me that could relate to these guys and like, life is not a straight path. Life is zigzagged,
right.
And people think, I've met psychologists who did everything by the book and got their doctorate by age 25 and, can write a research paper, but they don't have much life experience, and I'm not knocking them, but they're very different to me. Maybe
they're by the book. Yeah,
they're very by the book, and they're like, well, let me look in my textbook how I treat this. And it's like, for me, having those kind of difficult life experiences and kind of zigzagging my way to get where I am, it sounds so corny, but it's such a blessing, because I think working with criminals, like, I could relate to them, and be like, listen, dude, like, I almost went down your path too. And they would say to me, like, how do you know? And I'd be like, just because I'm on this side of the fence doesn't mean there wasn't a time in my life where I could have been on
you could have jumped in.
We're all human. We all make mistakes. And so I think relating to them really helped me a lot. And it made me realize that I do want to go right and not left, and help these people come from the left to go this way.
So after like so many years, I know you mentioned just in the previous answer, like that at some point it did get to you. So why don't you talk about the circumstances that finally led you to start your own practice?
Yeah. So, like I said, prison is always, going to be exciting, and it's never going anywhere. And so I can always go back. But, I worked in the Florida prison system at the master's level. And then I did my pre-doctoral and postdoctoral training in California, where I saw a much more progressive and treatment-oriented prison system. And then I came back to Florida. And like I said, I wrote my dissertation on how horrible privatized prisons are in Florida. So I don't even know how they rehired me. They didn't care. But I was like, you know, people would say, how do you work in prisons? How do you work with sex offenders and serial killers? And the inmates were never the problem. The bureaucracy, the administration, and the lack of resources was the problem. That was the problem, because inmates are inmates. You expect them to lie to you, yell at you, curse at you. You that's what you signed up for. But what you didn't sign up for is the rest of the stuff, and the, you know, the fact that it's about money and not treatment, and the bureaucratic mess that we don't want to do. So I really just got really burnt out, and it's easy to get burnt out working in prisons because you go in, you go through security, you get accused of stuff. If you have problems with the correction officers, they won't open the doors. I mean, it's constant stress and constant.
And you're the bad guy, right? In a way, you're the bad guy.
Yeah. Well, with the good thing with inmates is that when you're in mental health, you're considered kind of the good guy. But yes, sometimes you are viewed as the bad guy because you get to go home, and that in and of itself is not fair, you know. So I started working a little bit more on the forensic side, which means more in kind of the court system. And I started doing competency evaluations, which is assessing if somebody is competent to stand trial, not guilty by reason of insanity. I do police officer evaluations to see if they're fit for, you know, being police.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, yeah. And especially after George Floyd, which was horrible. They really wanted to make sure that they were assessing for integrity, racist, and cultural bias. You know, nobody wants another George Floyd on their hands. So that's really interesting. And I do, you know, some clinical work, some supervision, some webinar. I'm a little bit all over the place. So I still do set foot in correctional facilities, but it's not 40 hours a week anymore, which is much, much better for my mental health.
Oh, bad.
Yeah. Hey, do psychologists see psychologists?
Absolutely. I would never go without a therapist. Actually, that's a really good question. I don't know about most psychologists. Some of my friends, I'm like, you need a shrink really bad. Me personally, I have no problem in admitting that I have my own therapist. I've had my own therapist for a long time. I believe in I've been on psych meds. I believe in breaking the stigma. I mean, for me, you know, especially with all the things I've seen and dealt with, how could I not have a therapist? You know, it would be a disservice to my patients if I wasn't taking care of my own mental health, because how can I take care of somebody else's if I'm thinking I'm better than, you know what I mean? Like, absolutely. Psychiatrist, therapist, give it to me, give it all. I'll take it.
So what are some of the services that you offer in your practice?
So usually my forensic services, you know, those come to me through the judges and lawyers in the court system, but I do any kind of forensic evaluation, sex offender evaluations, violence risk, competency, not guilty by reason of insanity, malingering. Hey!
That's our
clinical evaluations, I do general clinical diagnostic assessment, you know, people who just say something's wrong, but I don't know what it is, or somebody told me I'm, you know, a narcissist or borderline or bipolar, and I don't know. IQ testing, ADHD, autism testing, so all kinds of testing. I don't do that much therapy, only because therapy is a little bit time consuming, you know, to spend an hour with a client when I really have a lot of evaluations to do. So I do a little bit of therapy. I do some webinars, which are on my website. I do some training on psychopathy and malingering. I do some clinical supervision of students and pre-docs and post-docs. So I love having my private practice because I get to have my foot in. I get to do podcasts with really cool people, you know. Hi, cutie pie. Oh, that's the hugger. So I get to do a little bit of everything, and I really love it.
Yeah, and I believe it's called Rise Psychological Services, right?
Yes, Rise Psychological
Services. We'll be sure to link that in the description when this episode comes out.
And you know, there's always hope, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's always hope that we can figure this out.
Not to be Debbie Downer, but unfortunately, my father passed away last week. He was 81 and had health issues.
So sorry.
Thank you, I appreciate it. But you know, after he passed away, thank you, I appreciate it. But after he passed away, I started thinking, you know, all these things that we assign value to, the car, the degrees, you know, the house, what kind of brand bag is that? None of that stuff matters. None of it matters. You know, is it nice to have a little extra in life? Sure, we're human. But really, you know, human interactions, human relationships, family, friends, that's where the real stuff is at, you know. I'm so grateful that I was well enough and you know, put together enough to be there for my dad at the end of life, because that's really all that matters. You know, it doesn't,
Right.
the rest doesn't matter. The car, all that fluff stuff that social media throws at us, irrelevant, just irrelevant.
Yeah.
People, get off social media if you think that you have to compete with your friends. Get
Yeah.
off social media, because it is not a competition. You'll lose every time.
Yeah.
You know, but your father lived till 81. Oh,
Yeah.
that's a good life.
Yeah.
That's a good life, you know. And he's still here with you. I talk to my mom every day.
Me too.
I talk to my mom every day because she was my best friend, you know. And I mean, there was a time that, we didn't get along.
Yeah.
And, you know, and then at the end of life, she was there for us, and she was just my best friend. And, you know, she's in bingo playing playing bingo with her best friend Annie and my two sisters. You know, I'm happy for her.
Yeah. So why don't you, where can people find you? Give us all the links to social media.
Yes.
Or not hashtags, sorry. Yeah.
So let's see. My website is www.risepsychological.com. And if you click on webinars, there are links to trainings on psychopathy, trainings on malingering. And anybody who DMs me on my Instagram, I'll give you a code to get 50% off. And my Instagram.
Oh,
wow.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll give you guys codes left and right. I'll give you guys 90% off codes.
I love you.
For sure. And my Instagram.
I'm going to stalk you now.
Yeah, do it.
I didn't know I'm going to stalk you.
Do it. My Instagram is also Rise Psychological Services, and I post a lot of forensic stuff because there's so many mental health accounts on Instagram. It's like bombarded. So I really try to stick to my niche of forensic. So a lot more, again, psychopaths in prison and a lot of videos and instructional. So I'm on LinkedIn. Hopefully I'll get it together and have a book that Neil will write for me, and then we can revisit.
Yeah, for sure.
This is going to happen, people. I find you one of the most fascinating people I think I've ever talked to in my life. You really are.
Yeah.
You guys
and
are
our
so
hearts
awesome.
go out to you for your father, but like I said, he's still here with you.
Yeah.
And you have been just a joy to have on.
Thank
really.
you so much. I really appreciate you guys having me. You guys have been awesome hosts.
But Lina, thank you again. You have just
so
been
much
fascinating, and we will talk soon. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Neil, I'll email you my number.
You.
Sure.
Okay.
All right.
Bye, kiddo.
Bye.
Take care. Thanks. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Lina Haji, for being our guest.
Be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at all the links listed in the description. And don't forget to hit like on this video and subscribe to this channel so you never miss an episode. And if you want to show us a little extra love, we also have a link for donations. Thank you, everyone, once again, and we will see you right here next week at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.